Good morning, everybody. Looks like our live stream is struggling to get started. Oh, there we go. Hey, good morning, everybody. And if you're tuning in live or watching this later, good to be with you this morning. This post was inspired actually by my work with Michael. He's the client that I've worked with the longest of anybody that I've kind of done the coaching and helping with this Centering for Wisdom practice. So Michael, if you're happen to see this, hey, how's it going? Been working with him for over a year now and kind of bringing his centering practice and applying it to his career, his vocation, his sense of vocation, I should say, his marriage and his family. And it's been a real great joy actually to walk with him and see all the ebb and flow and the changes. And so it inspired this thought for me about how our contemplative practice, whether that's centering prayer and meditation or some other kind of practice, whatever gets us into that space of centering for wisdom, if we stick with it for long enough, it's going to change and ebb and flow and look different at different periods of our lives. So with Michael specifically, we've been talking about this recently. He, there was a period where he was doing the kind of, in centering prayer and meditation, we talk about this as guidelines, right? So there are teachings, practices, working with a sacred word. And one of those guidelines is to sit for 20 to 30 minutes twice a day. Now that's sort of, again, it's a guideline, it's a suggestion. If you tuned into my post last week, I was talking about the lessons I learned from some trauma-informed yoga, about everything being a suggestion, everything being an invitation. So we don't talk about these as hard and fast rules. I do think sometimes the teaching of centering prayer can maybe tend towards that little bit of rigidity about it has to be a certain time or a particular way. And maybe that's a little bit of the Catholic roots and background of that tradition finding its way in. But as those of us who are not monks, not sisters or monks or people living in a monastery or in a religious vocation, are living this out and infusing it into our daily lives, which is happening more and more, we're just going to have to be more flexible. So for Michael, that meant there was a period where kind of sitting was a bit of a challenge for him. So we talked about how he could work with his sacred word and develop that same kind of consent or saying yes to what is arising in his life while walking. And he had a particular place that he would do that. Now what's interesting is that worked really well for a while. And the last time we checked in, he was talking about how he really felt like things had gotten a little busier, a little fuller, and that stress was starting to pile up, and that he sort of wanted to go back. His practice was guiding him. You might say the Spirit was guiding him to go back to doing that sitting meditation, at least in the morning. So what was really cool that he did, because my job is just to kind of ask questions and help people discern, where is the Spirit guiding you? How do you want to live out of this divine center of wisdom? And so as I was asking him, well, what do you want that to look like? He was saying, I want to get up and do this in the morning and actually sit down and do the centering prayer meditation. And he added, usually at some point when he's doing that, his kids start to wake up and come downstairs. But his solution to this that was very flexible and allowed his practice to evolve, and I think a very mature response was, okay, well, I'm going to sit down at, whatever, I can't remember what time he said he was getting up, before the kids get up, do my practice. And when the kids wake up, whether that's 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes into my practice, that's the time that's like my timer going off, right? It's like the Spirit saying, okay, now it's time to be present with your kids, help them get ready for school, kind of move into that transition. And I love the flexibility that he was bringing into it. It was a really powerful way to, have that kind of mature approach. Now, that could work for a while, and then it probably will switch again in the future. So that was kind of an example from Michael's work. The phrase centering prayer, there are lots of pieces of the Christian tradition that centering prayer emerges from, though you don't necessarily have to be part of the Christian tradition to practice it. I know a group of Muslim women who are love to go and practice with a friend of mine who have friends of mine who have a center in Nebraska, and of all places, right? But the roots of it come from the Desert Mothers and Fathers, St. John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, and this anonymous book from the 11th century called The Cloud of Unknowing. Thomas Merton is a contemporary 20th century monk that some of you may have heard of. The phrase centering prayer actually came from his writings, where he talked about his prayer being centering into God. And I want to share with you a quick quote from Merton, because I think it's a beautiful way to think about this process of allowing your practice to evolve and mature at different points in your life. And this is from a letter that he wrote to Abdul Aziz, who was a Sufi mystic and teacher and writer. So Sufism is a mystical movement or strand within the Islamic tradition. So Merton kind of writing across traditions here, what we call interspirituality, the sharing of experiences across different faith traditions. So here's how Merton, or here's what he wrote about his prayer that I think is just beautiful. He says, this is the beginning of the quote, "Strictly speaking, I have a very simple way of prayer. It's centered entirely on attention to the presence of God and to God's will and God's love. That is to say, it is centered on faith, by which alone we can know the presence of God. One might say this gives my meditation the character described by the prophet," he's referring here to the prophet Muhammad, "as, quote, being before God," excuse me, "being before God as if you saw God," end quote. So that's from the prophet Muhammad. I don't know if that's in the Quran. It's not cited here. Then Thomas Merton continues, "Yet it does not mean imagining anything or conceiving a precise image of God." I'm sorry, excuse me. "It does not mean imagining anything or conceiving a precise image of God, for to my mind this would be a kind of idolatry. On the contrary, it is a matter of adoring God as invisible and infinitely beyond our comprehension, and realizing God as all. My prayer tends very much toward what you call fana." Now, fana is a word in the Sufi mystical tradition. I don't know if it's Arabic or another language. That means annihilation or total loss of self, or sometimes like a dissolving of the self into God. Or in the Buddhist tradition, you could think of it as no self, the recognition that there is no separate self that exists independent of everything else around us. So he says, "My prayer tends very much toward what you call fana. There is in my heart this great thirst to recognize totally the nothingness of all that is not God. My prayer is then a kind of praise rising up and out of the center of nothing and silence." And he writes the words nothing and silence with capital N and S. "If I am still present myself," because there is no self, "this I recognize as an obstacle about which I can do nothing unless God removes the obstacle. If God wills, God can then make the nothingness into a total clarity. If God does not will, then the nothingness seems to itself to be an object and remains an obstacle. Such is my ordinary way of prayer or meditation. It is not thinking about anything, but a direct seeking of the face of the invisible," again, invisible with a capital I, "which cannot be found unless we become lost in God who is invisible." So that's the end of his quote. So I love that way that he is not, bound to a particular method. I think we all need some kind of teaching or method to get us started. That's actually how the modern teachings around centering prayer and meditation started. It was monks primarily living out of this tradition and learning it because they were surrounded in it, and recognizing that people were going to the East to learn these different practices, and that many people who grew up in the West that maybe grew up Christian, maybe stay Christian or kind of leave that behind or look for other traditions, aren't even aware that this is part of the tradition and that there is this really deep practice of meditation and contemplative prayer in the tradition. So the method was really not created to be this like rigid kind of container that we have to stick to, but was intended to be this gift out of the tradition to help people like us living in the world and the busyness of our lives to have a simple method that we could easily integrate into daily life. So we have that, like the teachings, as I mentioned before, the suggestions, the guidelines that can be learned in just a couple hours. That's not the hard part. And then we have integrating it into our daily life. And then we have that lifelong process of allowing it to just evolve over time. And that's part of what we have to balance. And that's what I work with people to do. Having been doing this practice myself for over 20 years and worked with lots of people in large group workshops, in one-to-one coaching, and all along that continuum to help you integrate that into your daily life. That's really my passion. That's what I love to do, honestly, more than anything, besides maybe doing my contemplative practice myself and spending time with my family, my wife and kids. This is really my passion and my why. So a lot of this comes down to paying attention and discerning where the Spirit is guiding, learning the practice, and then allowing it to evolve through that interplay between your own life, your own experience, your own body, your own mind, and how that works. So if that's something that sounds interesting to you and you're looking for a little bit more depth and grounding to get into that ebb and flow of life and to allow the Spirit to guide you, to get in touch with that inner wisdom, and to be able to show up in your life with a little more confidence, but without being attached to the outcomes, a little more, sometimes a lot more peace of mind, and a greater depth of connection to God or to something higher than yourself, then I would invite you to book a breakthrough session with me. So I will put a link to that. It's thomasjbushlack.com/apply. Again, it's thomasjbushlack.com/apply, or you can just click on that link right there, and that'll take you to a page where you can book a call with me. It's a no pressure, honest conversation just about where you're at, where you'd like to be, what kind of support you're looking for, and then if I can help you, we'll discuss that, and if not, I will look for other resources that might be a better fit for where you're at. So that's the deal. I appreciate all of you being here. Thanks for tuning in. Wish you all the best in continuing to listen to where the Spirit is guiding you in your practice. And if that leads you and guides you to a conversation with me or deeper engagement online, then I would welcome that. So blessings to all of you. Keep up your practice. And I will look forward to talking with you when you click on that link, and have a great rest of your day and week. Thanks, everybody.